Welcome to Washington in Focus Daily. It is Monday, May the 11th, 2026. I'm Carlene Johnson, the Center Square's state government reporter. And in today's episode of Washington in Focus Daily, Federal Way's mayor is not holding back in criticisms of the King County Regional Homelessness Authority over the recent audit. In fact, he is suggesting that the agency doesn't deserve another dime until there is a full forensic accounting, not just an audit, he says, of the agency. He has some very sharp words as someone who didn't support the formation of the agency to begin with back in 2019. And as a former prosecutor, he says if they find in this accounting that, in fact, there is evidence of any fraud, he wants people to be held criminally liable. Maybe not fraud, but what happened to the monies and questions different agency. Now we're talking about the Department of Children, Youth, and Families, and many questions that remain all these months later about unusually large daycare subsidies that have been paid out. Home daycares as well receiving millions of dollars, but we don't get to find out who they are in the latest award recipients that went out, announced by the Office of Governor Bob Ferguson through the Department of Commerce last month. Another nearly $57 million paid out. And in many cases, these are unnamed daycare facilities. And we're being told by the Department of Commerce that there are privacy protections based on a law passed in the state of Washington many, many years ago. Interesting update and some pushback from one of the Republicans who's been most vocal about the criticisms of DCYF and the response from Senator Leonard Christian. You're going to want to stick around for that in today's episode of Washington in Focus Daily. So let's dive in. The mayor of Federal Way, which happens to be the community where I live, is calling for an immediate suspension of all spending activities with the King County Regional Homelessness Authority, KCRHA, until a forensic accounting is complete to learn where every dollar has gone. Now, he is mentioning this because that recent forensic audit that was conducted uncovered $13 million missing completely, unaccounted for, and a nearly $45 million deficit for this organization that has received more than $530 million since its inception in 2019. Here's part of my conversation with Federal Way Mayor Jim Farrell last Friday.
This is on a scale of incompetence that is nearly unheard of. And while I'm not making any accusations, I think it's critically important with that amount of money missing that I've got sort of a three-point approach that I think is going to be very important. Number one, I think what we're going to be calling for is the immediate suspension of all activities with the regional authority. And then secondly, secure the computers and the records of the association. And then thirdly, conduct a forensic accounting, not an audit, an accounting. This money can be found as, there has to be bank records, transfer records. They need to figure out where the money went. And that's what needs to occur. Not a forensic audit, a forensic accounting. And then if it appears that there's any sort of fraud, then that needs to be referred to law enforcement. Before they give this organization another dollar, they need to suspend the operations and figure this out, because the foundation of which this was built on has crumbled. And I wouldn't support, as a taxpayer and as an elected official, any more public money going to this organization until this is fixed.
So again, Mayor Farrell wants that immediate suspension of all activities with the regional authority. And then he wants also access to their computers and all of their banking records for that full forensic accounting. And he kind of explained to me that a forensic accounting is a little bit more looking for specifically financial irregularities, typically within the framework. This is done typically when you think there might be something here untoward that we need to uncover. potential financial fraud or misconduct for, staff members. Who gave how much to who? And why don't we have a full accounting of this? He wants that, he says, before another dollar should be spent. And then he says, if in fact any fraud is uncovered, it should be referred to law enforcement. Now, should note again that Mayor Farrell did not support the formation of KCRHA nearly 6 years ago. He believed that to be the wrong approach, even though it's obviously a regional crisis. It's different for each community, and each community might have a much different idea for the approach to homelessness and a drug crisis. I live here in Federal Way, and it's very much a drug and mental health crisis that puts many people on the streets, or even if there's a shelter available for them or a place that would offer them housing, many people are not making that choice because they're not required, in exchange for that housing or shelter opportunity, to turn their life around and to get sober and to make a different choice. So, Mayor Farrell, again, has not been supportive of the whole housing first approach. And again, I remind you that since 2019, the King County Regional Homeless Authority has been given more than $500 million, nearly $500 million in funding to address the homelessness problem, even as things have worsened.
I don't think it is responsible or appropriate to provide any more resources to this organization. I have never believed that the formation of the Regional Homelessness Authority was necessary or justified. And I think it is the responsibility of King County government, Seattle government, and individual governments to manage what happens in their jurisdictions. And to create this separate entity, I think has created a circumstance in which public money has essentially gone missing. And that's really what's going on, is if it can't be accounted for, it's missing. And so we need to figure out why or how that happened. And maybe it's bad accounting, but we need a forensic accounting and figure out where it went before another dollar goes in this.
Now, as we reported last week here at the Center Square and on Washington in Focus Daily, King County's approach at this point, after this kind of alarming audit finding, was to implement a 90-day review and evaluation period. They are saying we're not going to completely disband the agency at this point. But we do want to spend 90 days and kind of do a deeper dive and see where all the money has gone. The city of Seattle, which is responsible for about 60% of all of KCRHA's funding, with the rest coming from King County, the state, and federal funding. So Seattle's got, a big chunk invested in this. They're also moving to require more transparency and accountability from the agency, but at the same time expressing some of those concerns about simply dissolving it and having local jurisdictions take over. But again, Mayor Farrell, that former King County prosecutor, said after reading through the entire audit very closely, which he told me he did, he wants to make sure that they don't get another dollar until there's this full accounting of where that money is. Now, KCRHA was required to respond by last Friday, May the 8th, to the audit findings. I want to put this up for you because part of what King County confirmed with us via email that they received was to say the executive's office and DCHS, which is the Department of Community and Human Services, are closely reviewing the letter to ensure the corrective actions meet our expectations. We continue to engage with the King County Council, City of Seattle, KCRHA Governing Board, partner cities, service providers to gather all the facts and work together on a planned and deliberate path forward without disrupting critical services for people living unsheltered. One more little number I want to throw out to you, because we're expecting some new numbers from KCRHA on their latest homeless count. Every couple of years, for the federal government, in order to continue to receive federal funding, they have to provide what's our latest, what they call a point in time count. They do that in January every 2 years. It is reported to the feds. In 2024, so the last, 2-year period cycle that we have numbers for, KCRHA reported 16,868 individuals living in homelessness. Now, that does not mean these are people that are all on the streets counted countywide. These are people in shelters and temporary housing as well, people living in their cars, and then completely unsheltered individuals. So, again, that number was 16,868. That was a 26% increase from 2 years prior. 2022 was the last count that had to be reported to the feds. And we expect by the middle of this month, we're going to see the latest numbers from KCRHA for how many folks are living in homelessness in King County. So we'll see if there's been an improvement or things have gotten exponentially worse. It is a hugely important issue to be following, especially given the gigantic taxpayer investment in this. Now, to our second topic in today's episode of Washington in Focus Daily. It has been nearly 6 months since we here at the Center Square began investigating inexplicably large taxpayer subsidies going, in many cases, to home daycare providers in King County. In some cases, these are providers that are in very close proximity. You can put your address in on the Child Care Aware website and pretend you're looking for a daycare provider in your neighborhood. Depending on where you live, especially some parts of South King County, you may find an unusually large number of home daycare providers receiving taxpayer subsidies in your community. There has still been no state official agency response to say, we're alarmed by some of these numbers that have been exposed by members of the media, to say, we're going to look at this. We're going to take this very seriously. Instead, we have the Department of Children, Youth, and Families, the Department of Commerce, the state AG's office, the governor, the state auditor, all telling us, really nothing to see here. There is nothing that amounts to fraud, despite the fact that we had the state auditor, Pat McCarthy, coming out recently with the discovery of $37 million of discrepancy in the numbers. She didn't call it fraud, but she says we're unable to account for about $37 million. Now, mind you, this was not a complete audit of the agency and all of the taxpayer subsidies that go out to providers. This was their annual sampling, and this is what was uncovered in this most recent audit. Not a full audit. Again, really important to be mindful of that, because we did press the state auditor in the middle of this audit before the findings were released to say, hey, here's what we have seen. Here's what's being reported, not just by the Center Square, but some other independent journalists that have gone out and been exposing the same thing going back to the end of December. Are you going to open this up to a larger audit? And the response was, no, we'd have no intention of doing that at this point. Senator Leonard Christian, Republican from Spokane Valley, is the ranking minority on the Housing Services Committee, and he's been for answers.
When the auditor says, "Hey, there's a loss of 37 million that we think were overpayments, or where there's not necessarily fraud," but then they didn't look for fraud, and that's a real issue. And then yet we in Human Services Committee are not even looking to see if there is an issue there. Again, this is very concerning to the state and to the people of our state. This is not my money; it's the citizens. And again, we put out $130 million on one lawsuit for DCYF sending a young person back into a home when they were supposed to, had a very good cause not to send that person back. And a child died, and the state ended up recently with a $130 million lawsuit. That's our tax dollars. That's schools, not going to police, not going to services. That's money going to somebody because we made a mistake at the so why are we continuing on to hide or block anyone from looking into us when it's clear, billions of dollars paid out in lawsuits? And yet we're going to hide what would be able to stop some of this bad acting and some of this bad behaviors and look into it. It's just like they want to spend more money on lawsuits. It's nuts.
So, just under a month ago, Governor Bob Ferguson, along with the State Department of Commerce and the Department of Children, Youth, and Families, announced the awards of more than $56 million in grants to 74 different early learning providers across the state. These funds, they say, will create more than 2,000 new childcare spaces and advance these high quality childcare opportunities statewide. So some of these are going to daycare centers in the state that are well established, looking to expand, looking to do, renovations to their facility to offer more space for daycare. Some of these are home daycares that are also looking to do some renovations and upgrades, maybe get some new furniture, what have you. The problem that has been identified is that many of these providers receiving these most recent awards are unidentified, despite the fact that when the governor put out his press release, he put a link that says the complete list of awarded projects can be found here. Well, when you click on the here link, it comes up with many named providers. You see not the address, but ABC Daycare in Lakewood is getting $2 million to renovate. But many of these are simply listed as home facilities, unnamed home facilities. So we immediately, when that list came out, went back to the Department of Commerce and to DCYF and said, what gives? Who are these people receiving large taxpayer subsidies, especially at a time when there's been lots of questions around this? Why are we again awarding grants, large grants, to unnamed providers? And we were given an RCW, Revised Code of Washington, basically a law that was put into place back in 2016, so a full decade ago. And the State Department of Commerce told us this is why we can't give you the names of these. The problem is this RCW that was cited, put into place nearly 10 years ago, was put into place to protect the elderly from basically identity theft and fraud. That was the motivation for that law being passed at the time, such that those people's identities wouldn't be put out there publicly. We don't want their names, their home addresses, their phone numbers, the social security numbers being listed anywhere publicly, because they could be and were in many cases being taken advantage of by those who would prey on their identities. That was the motivation for this law. But this is now being cited as a reason to protect the identities, even the business names of home daycare providers in our state receiving millions of dollars in taxpayer subsidies. Senator Christian says this all ends up looking like there's something to hide here from the public. We weren't even asking for addresses. We were asking for provider names, and then we could do the deep dive ourselves, and find out who these recipients are. But it's all being kept very secret at this point, which leads to at least this reporter wanting to know what the heck's going on. And Senator Christian has every intention of trying to find out the names of these providers himself. Why are we keeping things from the public? Because it just doesn't look good.
I guess for myself, I'm a little shocked that that our current attorney general literally puts out a statement that if you go off and try and do an investigation, that we're going to call you a hate crime and prosecute you, and it scared off the legacy media to even look into it. To be honest with you, that just blows my mind that the legacy media can be scared off that easy. That's their job. And for our own, $36 million that is not necessarily fraud, but just can't be accounted for, and the records aren't there for, going back 4 years. And yet there's so lack of accountability. We had series of two pretty, forceful bills. Luckily, we got them stopped, but that was going to block any looking into this potential fraud. And so with us getting the bills blocked, the governor announces another $57 million towards daycares, in grants. it's almost like it's brazen, And then, oh, by the way, we're going to block the names and phone numbers and business addresses for the folks who are getting grants. You know, what 20 of the 50s or 70 some odd grants that are being given out, 20 plus are being blocked from even saying who they're going to. I mean, that's ridiculous. What happened to transparency in our state? So now I'm definitely concerned. I don't know of any direct fraud, but I will say that when our own auditor has comes out and says there's questionable items going here, one would think the legislature would be saying maybe we should look into this a little bit. But that even being is blocked as much as possible. So nothing to see here. Keep moving on. Let's give it more money. Oh my word.
Now, this morning, I reached back out to the Washington Department of Commerce to inquire about them citing this RCW for keeping these provider names private. I asked, specifically what I just spelled out to you in this podcast. This was not created to, protect the business names of people receiving large taxpayer subsidies. This law was passed to protect our elderly from potential identity theft. And the response I received from them, and I'll just read this to you quickly. It says, Commerce relies on the state attorney general's office for interpretation of such laws. The best way to proceed to get this information is to submit a public records request to ensure the information is handled appropriately. So, in other words, this wasn't our idea to rely on this RCW. It was the AG's office idea to rely on this. So we will, in fact, submit that public records request and provide any follow up that we receive. So that is it for today's episode of Washington in Focus Daily for this May the 11th. Beautiful sunshine out. Hope you get a chance to get outside and enjoy some of that. As always, thank you so much for watching. Check out our Center Square Washington page for more stories like this, and I hope to see you tomorrow.